Happy Saturday, folks. This is Jason. What if I told you that the United States has a decent possibility, probably better than even possibility right now, of gaining two more states in the next 4 years? And it's not the two states that the Democratic Party has been pushing for the past 20 years. Those states being, those places being the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico has had several referendums on that matter, and they have overwhelmingly voted to maintain the status quo, which is as a territory of the United States. However, the two new states that I have seen a lot of in the news lately are actually Canadian provinces. Those two Canadian provinces are leading a movement which has been nicknamed Wexit, which is basically a portmanteau of Western exit. There are two of the Canadian Western provinces, and they have increasingly voiced extreme displeasure with the federal government in Ottawa over the past several years. It's come to a fever pitch in about the last 6 months. And you're like, well, how can they leave? How can they possibly leave Canada? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. There was some legislation that was passed in the 1990s that was done as a concession to Quebec, which of course has screamed for independence for as long as most of us have been alive. Now, so this legislation allows provinces to declare independence through ballot referendums. And Quebec, of course, never did this because the economic impacts of that for them are negative. They receive more money from the federal government than they pay out in taxes. Now, for the two provinces that I'm speaking of, this is the opposite is the case. They provide billions more every year to the federal government in Ottawa than they get back. And this includes with the national Medicare health system. The provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan could become the 51st and 52nd states. And before you think I'm blowing a whole bunch of hot air, Alberta already has a referendum question in place. And it could come to the ballot in March of next year, March of 2026. The requirement is only about 240,000 signatures. Now consider that Alberta has a population of a little over 5 million. That's not much to get, and that they already have almost 300,000 pledges for signatures. So even if 20% of those don't ultimately wind up signing the petition, they still have enough to get the referendum on the ballot. And Canada, with the Western oil producing provinces, have what are called equalization payments. Equalization for what? I don't know what the hell that they'd be talking about, but anyway, that's what they're called. Where energy revenue gets shipped east to Ottawa and the federal government. This has been a major bone of contention for decades now, but only recently has it become insane because the governing Liberal Party has taken, they always have taken a notable environmental tack, but now they're using it almost as an excuse to shame Alberta and Saskatchewan into giving up the oil and other energy revenues. More on that in a second. Alberta, of course, is the largest oil producer in Canada by a wide margin. And that money basically comes close to balancing Canada's budget at this point. So the federal government's budget is basically on Alberta's back. And to a lesser degree, Saskatchewan, its neighbor to the east. Now, what I wanted to talk about tonight, in addition to these grievances that these provinces have, they can petition for independence After they do this, there's two possible routes for these provinces. One would be independent nations, or an independent nation if they merged. The problematic thing with that one is that Alberta and Saskatchewan also happen to be the only two landlocked provinces in Canada at this moment, and they're being landlocked would completely cripple their economies without any ocean-going access. Now, I fully realize that the United Nations does have a law in place that landlocked members of the UN have to be provided coastal access. The most extreme example of this I can think of is actually Ethiopia, which is landlocked by a minor amount after the independence of Eritrea. Now, countries are required to provide Ethiopia port access. However, they are not required to do it for free. And so an independent Alberta and Saskatchewan would be required to have ocean-going access provided by most likely Canada, or what remains of Canada. But they could exact a very stiff price, much like Eritrea does with Ethiopia. So, I mean, they can make access, extremely exorbitant, almost to the point where they're still paying Ottawa a substantial amount of money without getting anything back. But in their case, it would be ocean-going access. So, that leaves the other option, which is to join the United States. This is the more practical option, in my opinion. And I want to talk about the potential impacts of this on the United States in several regards. So if Alberta and Saskatchewan do join as the 51st and 52nd states of the United States, let me go through the political impacts first. The Democrats are going to heavily oppose their entry as states for the same reason that the Republicans have refused to support the District of Columbia's entrance as a state. Because if Alberta and Saskatchewan were states, that's a guaranteed 4 Republican senators, or virtually guarantees 4 Republican additional senators. Just like if DC became a state, it would guarantee 2 Democrat senators. The House doesn't get fought over as much because the House doesn't have as much power as the Senate, but nonetheless, let's go through that real quick. Alberta would send either 6 or 7 members to the House of Representatives. Now, the ratio on that one is probably going to be 4-3 or 4-2 in favor of the GOP. The United Conservative Party presently controls the Alberta House of Assembly, and by a margin of only about 10 votes at this point. So it's the margin is 47-40 in favor of the United Conservative Party, as opposed to the opposition New Democratic Party, which is Canada's, I don't want to say far left, but further left party than the Liberal Party, which controls the federal government at this point, which is where Alberta has its major issues with the Liberal Party and Canadian Premier Mark Carney. As U.S. states, so that's the political breakdown for Alberta. For Saskatchewan, of course, there's 2 new Republican senators, and with a population of 1.2 million, they would be on par with Montana, which sends 2 members to the House of Representatives. And with Saskatchewan, it would be identical to this. So that's the political impact. Economic impact. Alberta becomes likely the second biggest energy producing state in the United States behind Texas. The other thing that this would do in terms of energy and economy is it would revive the Keystone XL pipeline, which the U.S. government struck down, but under a Trump administration, it's definitely a go. And Alberta, of course, would be interested. They've been trying to strike pipeline deals with the United States for well over a decade now, and have been blocked by Ottawa at every opportunity, supposedly on green energy grounds. But pipelines are exponentially safer than rail tankers, which are transported by railroad. So the environmental argument doesn't really fly. Now, the other issue that to be addressed on this one would be what would now be an international border. In fact, it would move. The border between Alberta and the United States state of Montana would become a state border and not the international one that it is today. And Saskatchewan borders Montana and North Dakota. Those would in turn become state boundaries and not the federal ones. New federal borders would be created, though, on the western border of Alberta, crossing into British Columbia, and with Saskatchewan crossing between them and Manitoba would be an international border. To the north, a less impactful international border, and probably less patrolled, would be the one between Alberta and the Northwest Territories, as well as between Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories. So the borders would be exponential adjustment, and economically, going back to that here real quick, Alberta would become the second largest energy producing state. Saskatchewan would become the leading wheat producing state in the U.S., overtaking the two states that have alternated this title over the past couple decades. Those two states are North Dakota and Kansas. They would also become the leading producer of potash, which is an energy source. They're already basically the capital of production of that particular energy mineral in all of North America. Saskatchewan also produces uranium, which of course can be used either as an energy source or as a weapons grade. Could be used in American nuclear bombs. They're the biggest producer of that. The provincial boundary between Alberta and Saskatchewan would become a state boundary, would have not much impact. And actually, one city, which is called Lloydminster, which is where the two provinces recently had a joint session of their legislatures to discuss this whole independence thing. That would maintain its role basically as a state border city, akin to Texarkana in the United States, or Kansas City, Kansas versus Kansas City, Missouri. Lloydminster, however, is a single government entity. It just happens to straddle two different provinces at this point as statehood. I'm not sure how that would work out. That would have to be worked out. As it is, Lloydminster only has a population combined of about 30,000. So it's not a significant deal, but it would have to be worked out. One really interesting location is the small, extreme northern town of what is called Flin Flon. It is mostly in Manitoba, but a very small section, so about 8,000 people live on the Manitoba side. There's about 800 people in the Saskatchewan side. This would become an international border town, which would require some notable working through. I think it would become functionally similar to the present Canadian/Alaskan border town of Stewart, British Columbia, and Hyder, Alaska, which is down on the southeastern tip of the Alaskan Peninsula. And there's a unmanned border crossing at this location. And I think it worked very similar in Flin Flon. Those are the political and economic impacts. The other one I want to talk about here is professional sports, which is really interesting because the Calgary Stampeders and the Edmonton Elks are part of the Canadian Football League. Would the Canadian Football League still be the CFL in the now American states of Alberta and Saskatchewan? There's also the Saskatchewan Roughriders to consider as well. So there's 3 CFL teams that would now be in American states. Would they become NFL teams is a question. Well, the Saskatchewan Roughriders certainly would not, because they serve a market area with a province of maybe 1.2 million people. But the city that's in is Regina, which is the capital of Saskatchewan. That is a city of about 250,000 and a metro of not even 300,000. So that one's a no-go. With Edmonton and in Calgary, it's a little bit more complicated because those are cities of excuse me, metro areas of a little over 1 million people apiece. As NFL markets go, that would be pretty small. And I don't believe they have NFL caliber stadiums at this point. If those 2 teams were to join the NFL, the stadium issues would have to be addressed, because they don't presently have American stadium amenities, luxury box amenities, certain locker room amenities that NFL requires out of its teams are not in those present stadiums in Calgary and Edmonton. So, excuse me. What happened there is unknown. Transportation networks are another interesting part, because presently the Trans-Canada Highway goes east-west across both provinces through to the west coast in Vancouver, British Columbia, and then also going east into Manitoba and through the rest of the country. What would happen with that section of the Trans-Canada Highway? Well, that section of the Trans-Canada Highway still would serve a very valid purpose. It just wouldn't be Canadian anymore. It would connect the newly Americanized cities of Calgary, Alberta, and Regina, Saskatchewan. There's also a road called the Yellowhead Highway that splits from the Trans-Canada Highway in Manitoba, crosses into Saskatchewan, and then serves as a connector between Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and Edmonton, Alberta. Again, these would be American state highways at this point. And so the transportation aspect, railroads would be impacted as well, because of most of Canada's cross-continental railroads also traverse these provinces, and once they become states, you also have all sorts of international border implications, which would then cut these railroads in fragments. So that's that particular impact. Economically, these 2 provinces would actually fold in as states rather well, because they already have large amounts of connections with the United States. And Saskatchewan the Premier Scott Moe has recently stated that Saskatchewan trades more with Montana and North Dakota than it does with Ontario and Quebec. There would not be much lost on that one. In fact, it would just strengthen the present ties that they have with Montana, and North Dakota. Their immediate neighbors to the south. This actually goes beyond those two particular provinces at this point. We do have rumblings of disgruntledness in other parts of Canada outside of Ontario and Quebec. So let's go through those real quick, and I'm going to try to envision state possibilities for those areas. British Columbia is largely disenfranchised from Canada outside of Vancouver and Victoria, which are the notable cities. So let's say northern and northeastern British Columbia gets the independence bug on their own accord. Now, would they be able to... Now, I don't know how capable they would be of splitting from British Columbia itself. That's a little bit of a tougher nut to crack. But let's say they pulled it off. Well, if they were independent and joined forces with the other two provinces in a sort of agreement, they would... British Columbia has a very small town on the coast close to the southeastern tip of the Alaska Peninsula, which is called Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert has ocean access. This could provide that for the new U.S. states. I can't envision interior British Columbia becoming its own state. I can see them merging forces with Alberta and joining as part of Alberta, which would add maybe 500,000 people tops to Alberta's population. It wouldn't change the Senate composure whatsoever, and would possibly add one House seat, so it would go from 6 to 7 to 7 to 8. And the other province with some reservations, especially if the other two become states, because then they would have to start shouldering the economic burden they have to replace the money that gets shipped off to Ottawa at present. And they would never be able to they would never be able to fill that entire hole on their own. And that's the province of Manitoba, to Saskatchewan's immediate east, with their capital and by far largest city of Winnipeg. Manitoba contains a large amount of natural resources, not of the energy kind. It's a highly agricultural state. They're right behind Saskatchewan in the wheat production category. But they would stand on their own agriculturally as well. The impact on the Trans-Canada Highway would be similar here. Politically, as far as the Senate seats are concerned, Manitoba could possibly split them. It could be one to each party. And with a population provincially of about the same as Saskatchewan's, I think they're at about 1.5 million right now. Same scenario though, 2 House seats. And that little problem I mentioned with the town of Flin Flon in the deep north would be resolved. The other thing that Manitoba has that they could offer their prairie brethren, there's a small town at the very northeastern corner of Manitoba called Churchill. Churchill is building an ocean-going port as we speak because it's on the shore of Hudson Bay, and with climate change, that whole area could become a lot more accessible. If Saskatchewan and Alberta do decide to go their own as an independent nation, the possibility of Manitoba joining them would actually increase because of this port access, which would fulfill that need for those two provinces. This is why Manitoba is not landlocked, is because they do have that shore of Hudson Bay on the far north northeastern shore of the province. Manitoba also trades more with North Dakota at the present time than they do with the Ontario and Quebec to the east. So their impact would not be quite as large, but they would provide a tremendous benefit to an independent prairie former Canada in the form of port access. The other province that has been raising a bit, it's not even a province, it's a territory, that's been raising a big stink towards Ottawa lately, and that's the Yukon. Yukon, of course, is far to the northwest of the country. It is one of the 3 northern territories. Their major beef with Ottawa has been announced in the past couple of weeks, and that is with their contributions to the federal healthcare system versus what they receive back. They're also running a substantial trade deficit with Ottawa in that category. Now, Yukon only has a population of a little over 40,000. I don't believe it is viable as an independent U.S. state. The smallest U.S. state right now in population is Wyoming at about 550,000. Yukon is less than 1/10 of that. And there's no way in their right mind that I don't think anybody would approve of Yukon being its own U.S. state. They don't have the minerals that their neighbors to the south do. They don't have any real coastal access. Their only shoreline is in the far northern tip with the Beaufort Sea, which is a part of the Arctic Ocean. And there is no settlement and no port in that area. I believe that if they do get the independence bug, they could try to make a stand with the other provinces as an independent nation, but I don't see them becoming the 53rd or 54th state. If they do become independent and break away from Canada, I believe their future is merged with Alaska, which they do border. They're immediately to Alaska's east. If you look at Alaska, that whole big straight border on the east side, that's Yukon. Politically, Yukon has had a interesting back and forth history between the Yukon Liberal Party and the Yukon Party, which is actually their conservative equivalent. The Yukon Party president controls government there, but because I think they've been going right of center lately, I think they would fold into Alaska pretty easily. And I believe some of Alaska's National Wildlife Refuge that they've been talking about oil exploration in does extend over the border into Yukon. And some of that field, which now includes areas like Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, that particular oil field, if you go east down the Arctic Ocean coast, you move into Yukon, I believe some of that oil play does extend over that border. So there is some possible contributions from Yukon. Most of them might be in terms of, as far as natural resources go, like maybe wood. But they would not be a large oil producer. They would have a sliver of it, but not a large oil producer. The other thing about the northern territories is their First Nations people have always had a beef with the federal government. I would argue that the First Nations people in Canada have been given a much more raw deal than the Native Americans have in the United States. So how the other 2 territories would react is interesting. I can't make any prediction on that. The Northwest Territories is one of them. I mentioned their capital city in another episode this week, the territorial capital of Yellowknife. The other territory is Nunavut, which was broken off from the NWT back in 1998. It was carved into its own territory. Their capital city is the smallest capital in the entire country, which is Iqaluit, population of about 8,000. A small town on Baffin Island, which is actually separate from the rest of the Nunavut mainland. None of those three territories would be standalone states on their own. But of course, the NWT does have its own resources in the form of diamonds and gold that could be contributed. And Nunavut does not have much as far as that is concerned. Nunavut has always been a subsistence type of economy. A territory with only about 38,000 people across an area larger than the country of France. So that's my overall synopsis of the Canadian independence situation. And as I said, what if I told you that the United States could get its 51st and 52nd states? Well, there they are, Alberta and Saskatchewan. The rest of the area is probably not ripe for statehood, but they could become a vital component of an independent Western Canada. Now, if everybody were to break off on their own, life would get very difficult, if not impossible, for Ontario and Quebec. Because right now the Western provinces fund the budget. Right now the Canadian government does run a modest annual deficit, at least in comparison to us in America. But I mean, they're still running about a $60 billion a year annual budget deficit without the contributions of Alberta and Saskatchewan financially. This could double, and it would be borne upon the remaining provinces of Ontario, Quebec, and then the Atlantic provinces of Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, along with Newfoundland and Labrador. And so their per capita deficit would soar. And their ability to even maintain their federal healthcare system would be very much at risk. Especially if Alberta and Saskatchewan do become the 51st and 52nd states. Now, a lot has to happen before that happens, so if I'm an American flag maker, I'm not worried about getting too busy just yet. But should that day happen, those flag makers are going to be busier than a Texas water park in the middle of July. Getting new flags out with 52 stars on them. Like I said, I don't think they'll need to worry about any more stars because I don't think any of the other players are practical U.S. states. So there it is. What if I told you that America could have 52 states within the next 4 years? And the wheels and the legal machinations are already underway. This is not some sort of pipe dream. This is reality. These are provinces that have referendum items already drafted and ready to go. Once they can get to some preset calendar dates in the provincial constitutions, then they will be able to roll. And they already have, basically, both provinces already have the signatures in hand. The signature process just hasn't started yet. So anyway, that is my episode there. Enjoy your Saturday night, guys. We'll see you tomorrow on Sunday. Peace out, homies.